What is a paradox? Part of Reconstructing A is A by O.G. Rose. On the experiential difference between apparent contradictions and actual negations, and the consequences of seeking authentic selves versus paradoxical harmony. Looking up the definition of paradox isn't very helpful. Take what Webster offers us. First, a tenet contrary to received opinion. Second, a statement that is seemingly contradictory or opposed to common sense and yet is perhaps true. A self-contradictory statement that it at first seems true. An argument that apparently derives self-contradictory conclusions by valid deductions from acceptable premises. And one, such as a person, situation, or action, having seemingly contradictory qualities or phases. I'm sure I don't have to tell you this, but the second definition, part A, B, and C, are incredibly confusing. Is a paradox something that seems false, but ultimately is it? Or is it something that at first seems true that then turns out to be false? Why is 2B not just a logical fallacy? Is a paradox just a logical fallacy? And definition 1 just sounds like a false belief. What's going on? Paradox and contradiction are often used like similes, but paradoxes are different. Contradictions are combinations of inconsistencies that negate, which means they can only exist in thought and cannot be experienced. A paradox, however, is a combination of inconsistencies that don't negate, and this is because though paradoxes may logically negate, they don't experientially negate. Where there isn't a strong distinction between thinking and perceiving, or ideas and experiences, it is only natural for the term paradox and contradiction to practically become similes, which I think is what has generally happened in the West. This has cost us the category of paradox, and where we lose a category of language, we also lose a category of experience. Our world shrinks. A paradox is something that has an appearance of contradiction but isn't actually such. But the truth of a paradox is non-negating consistency is something that can only be experienced. Experience, not thinking, is how paradox and contradiction can be identified apart, which would suggest that a world that overthinks will struggle to meaningfully tell the difference, which will likely prove consequential. All this might sound strange, but it's pretty common. Take if I say Dan is nice and mean. That's a contradiction. Or is it? If we followed Dan around for a day, we would see that he was very mean at home but very nice at work, or vice versa. Dan was nice in one setting and not another, which would mean the phrase Dan is nice and mean is true even though the phrase on the surface seems to negate. Once we follow Dan around and experience how he lives his life, something that appears a contradiction turns out not to be mysterious at all. In fact, the phrase is an acknowledgement of a reality we all know well enough. There is a difference between our private and public lives. To think about a cat is to see something that's not around. This is a paradoxical phrase, but we easily understand what the phrase is suggesting and know it's not a negating contradiction. We've all experienced the strange reality of seeing something in our heads that's not actually in front of us, though it seems like a contradiction to say, I can see something that's not there. The experience of thinking can unveil how it is possible. Feeling both sad and happy when our friend moves away to start the jobs he always wanted, both wanting and not wanting for a vacation to end, both trying to be open to new possibilities while at the same time working hard at our current task. All of these notions sound like nonsense, logically, but they are all more than possible and sensible experientially. We all know what it's like to both want and not want something, to contain tensions and conflicts. It means we're alive, that we're human. Why don't paradoxes negate? Well, many reasons. The conflicting elements of a paradox could be separated in time. The elements could differ ontologically, say between the idea of a cat and a biological cat. The elements could be situational and never simultaneous, and so on. Unlike a paradox, a contradiction would be if to say Dan was on the top floor and bottom floor at the same time. This is literally impossible, but is the phrase Dan was on the top floor and bottom floor similarly negative? Not necessarily, but the second phrase leaves open-ended the role of time. It's not completely clear if the phrase means Dan was on the top floor and bottom floor at the same time or at different times. If the phrase means simultaneously, then the phrase is a contradiction, but if the phrase means at different times, it's only an apparent contradiction, which means it's a paradox. The phrase Dan was on the top floor and bottom floor may help point out why it's so easy to confuse paradox and contradiction, for the phrase could be either, depending on its use. If I use the phrase to mean right now, it's a contradiction, for it's a logical inconsistency that cannot be experienced. Whereas if I mean at different points of the day, the phrase is still a logical inconsistency in of itself, but the phrase can be sorted out in experience, for it's possible for Dan to move between rooms throughout a day. Experience is the key to distinguishing paradox and contradiction, which also means phenomenology is important, and so it's not surprising that societies obsessed with thinking struggle to tell the difference. If there is something about paradox that is critical to understand in order for us to fully understand the world, then the conflation of paradox and contradiction could be costing us in ways we hardly understand. For example, if humans are fundamentally paradoxical, the idea that we need to be authentic selves could prove problematic. A paradox is a collection of opposing possibilities that unfold through tension and time, which means that we will change or else be dysfunctional. But the authentic self can train us to think that change is bad, and though generally nobody would say this explicitly, the thought lurks in the back of our subconscious minds. We become confused about how much we should change and how much we should stay the same, and in the midst of that confusion, neurosis can develop and mental health suffer. The authentic self is not a complex that's all bad, and I myself have certainly used the language of authenticity, but it is important that the authentic self is used to refer to the genuine self and not used to refer to something ontological like a consistent self. Authenticity or ontological consistency is deeply problematic, even though there can be virtue in being faithful to trying one's best, trying to do what's right, and the like. But remaining the same person forever is not necessarily a virtue at all. It depends on what we mean. And in fact, if humans are paradoxes and need to unfold through time, remaining the same is arguably a vice and even deadly to the heart. No, we don't want to say all change is necessarily good or all consistency is necessarily bad, but we also want to be sure not to think that change is necessarily a threat to our true self. Truth can be found where there is growth. The metaphor that comes to mind with the authentic self is a statue, which makes consistency in weathering the storm everything. But if we are more like paradoxes, then we are more like seeds than statues, and this means change is part of our very being. We are a thing which grows. Is a seed consistently itself, even though it grows into a tree? Absolutely. For that potential was always part of the seed and meant to be realized, and the change is fitting. Furthermore, if the seed doesn't change, then the seed isn't being itself. Far from change being a threat, change is necessary, for growth is impossible without change. Authenticity is found in growth. How does a seed weather the storm and stay true to itself? By growing into a tree. To suggest humans are paradoxes isn't to say we are justified to avoid commitment, should never stand firm, or the like, but rather to say that commitment and unchanging aren't similes and can differ depending on what's fitting. A seed that stays a seed doesn't preserve or stay itself. Rather, it dies. I can't be myself if I cease to be. All of us know that a seed that stays a seed is dysfunctional, but since we use the wrong metaphor complex to understand ourselves, we can often think that there's something wrong with us if we change through time, between situations and the like. If indeed we are paradoxes, that means we will unfold through time, and if we think that means we're being inauthentic, it's practically inevitable that we will mentally suffer. Ideas have consequences. A paradox is an entity that realizes itself through time and gradually integrates itself into conflicting values and abilities, not because it is inconsistent, but because a paradox needs multitudes to be its full self. And also because a paradox learns what's good in one situation can be bad in another. Talking about big ideas in one situation could alienate people, while doing such in another situation could prove wonderful. Countless examples could be offered. The authentic self is in the business of maintaining consistency, but the paradoxical self is in the business of maintaining harmony between itself and the world. This suggests why a conflation of paradox and chaos, or postmodern relativism, is erroneous. For the paradoxical person indeed looks for harmony and what's fitting. To say, I am a paradox is not an excuse to justify being chaotic, ingenuine, or contradictory. People think being paradoxical justifies being contradictory because they conflate paradox and contradiction. As mentioned before, a significant error. We should never be a contradiction. If in fact there isn't a stable self, then trying to be consistent with it is impossible. Far from embracing chaos, the paradoxical person is the only one who has a chance of finding harmony. Better yet, the paradoxical person has a better chance of not overly focusing on the ego. Humility comes naturally. Paradoxical people pay attention to if they are doing what is fitting relative to the world and present situation, while authentic people tend to pay more attention to if they are being their true selves, which risks and even moralizes being ego-focused. But if indeed humans are paradoxical, then there is no stable self relative to which we can be consistent, and thus authentic people make their standard of doing what's right the same as doing what's impossible, and their mental health suffers accordingly. If a seed focused on being its true self and associated that with not changing, the seed would either have to fall into neurosis or die by stopping its growth. For a seed with the wrong values, there are only dead ends. Critically, paradox transforms differences into something to learn from versus something to avoid. If I have a true self, I'm always trying to remain consistent to that true self. When I encounter change, I can view them as threats, or potential changes I'll view as threat, which could take and cause me inauthenticity, versus see them as what I need to engage in if I am to be a full self. For paradoxes need opposing and conflicting dimensions in order to be themselves. Additionally, if I don't take in all the conflicting and varying dimensions of myself in the world, I won't learn how to live in harmony with the world, for it consists of conflicting and varying dimensions. And difference is a threat to the person trying to remain certain, yet difference is an opportunity for the person trying to be confident. And in fact, tests are needed if a confident person is to in fact have reason to be confident. So seeing ourselves as paradoxical transforms difference and change from threats into goals. In our pluralistic world, preaching authenticity is exactly the wrong strategy. In this way, authenticity is very fragile, while paradox is anti-fragile. Perhaps we have avoided thinking of ourselves as paradoxes precisely in hopes of achieving for ourselves mental clarity and health. And if indeed paradox and contradiction were similes, this would be a wise move. But tragically, it is precisely in avoiding accepting our paradoxical nature that we end up in contradiction and negation, precisely because we are paradoxical. Because we have the wrong ideas and values, we end up where we want to escape. What we fear is what has come unto us, but it's not too late to change course. We can always start viewing ourselves as seeds. For more by O.G. Rose, please visit ogrose.com, and thank you for your time.